Hello, Tara here. We are on chapter 23 of The Bridge to Belle Island. The next day dawned gray and rainy, which perfectly suited Isabel's mood. She sat in her father's study, facing their former coachman, the man who had driven her parents to their deaths. Mr. Booker stood beside her. He had agreed to join her without question, but secretly she needed his strength more than any legal advice. Mr. Grant stood before her, hat in gnarled hands, balding head bowed. "I'm sorry, miss. Awful sorry. If I could go back and do different, I would. If I could have lost my life in their place, I would." Isabel took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I know you feel badly, Mr. Grant. I will try to forgive you, but it will be difficult. I don't want to add to your pain, but learning you were inebriated that night has added to mine. It was not an unforeseeable, unavoidable accident as I have thought all these years, but a preventable one caused by an incapacitated driver." He grimaced. "I thought I could manage it. Almost did. But that mail coach come out of nowhere, its lamps not lit. The driver will run in behind and let the tapers run low instead of stopping to replace them. I should have noticed the coach sooner. Perhaps I would have, had my head been clearer. Don't know. How many times I've sifted through those few seconds, wondering if I could have avoided it somehow." He slowly shook his head, bending his hat brim. "I know it's my fault, at least mostly, not trying to shift the blame, but it's hard to live with." "That I can well imagine." "I'm awful sorry," he repeated. "I am too." He hesitated, then looked up at her beseechingly. "If you want to take me to the magistrate, I'll go willin' like. I've not had a drop to drink since that night, and I've given up driving. Only drove to London because Teddy said it would help ye. I'd do anything to help ye if I could. If there was any way I could make up for what I did, what I cost ye, but there ain't, I fear." "No, I'm afraid not." She glanced at Benjamin. "I will talk to my lawyer. I doubt there is anything to be gained by pressing for charges at this point, but I shall let you know. Good day." He nodded, murmuring, "Miss," and turned toward the door. Mr. Booker called after him, "May I ask one question before you go?" The old man turned back. "Miss Wilder believes her father wrote a new will before setting out on that journey. Do you happen to know anything about that?" The grizzled head nodded. "Aye. Asked me and the groom to sign it, Mr. Wilder did. He meant to deliver it to the lawyers after we met the ship at the London docks. Sadly, that never happened." He looked down at his hands. Isabel was glad for this confirmation, though it still didn't explain where the document was now. Mr. Booker said, "That will has never been found." Mr. Grant looked up in surprise. "No? That's odd. I'm afraid I don't know anything else about it." "Well, thank you anyway." The man slunk from the room, head bowed, the picture of shame and defeat. When they were alone, Isabel sighed and looked up at Benjamin. "I suppose you think I was too hard on him." "You were honest. It will take time to get over this new blow." "Yes, well, thank you for being here." Benjamin considered the situation. "I think it would be very difficult to get a conviction on the elder Grant after so many years, and without any witnesses except his own confession. But if you want to pursue it, I don't think so. He has punished himself enough. Served 10 years of self-torment and self-inflicted exile." Benjamin nodded. "And his son? You could charge the doctor with abduction." She looked thoughtfully out the rain-streaked window to the river beyond. Something wasn't right. With a frown, she rose and moved closer, leaning nearer the glass. The water level had risen. Forcing her thoughts back to the topic at hand, she inhaled deeply, then made her decision. "No formal charges, I don't think. Dr. Grant believed he was doing something for my own good, and did return me safely, as he said. But he had to know it was wrong. One doesn't act so secretive and sneaky otherwise." "So what will you do?" She turned from the window. "Leave that to me." Isabel wrote a note to Dr. Grant, asking him to meet with her. Jacob delivered it to the physician's office and returned wet through for his efforts. "Thank you, Jacob. Sorry to send you out in the rain. Why don't you go down to the kitchen, ask Mrs. Philpotts for a cup of chocolate, and sit near the fire? You'll be warm and dry soon enough." "Yes, miss. Thank you. Sounds a treat." In the meantime, Isabel kept returning to the window to look out at the river. The rain shower continued. Normal for spring, she reminded herself. But the water was definitely rising. Carlotta joined her there, wringing her hands. Isabel sought to reassure her. "The river rises every few years, Lottie. Don't worry." Carlotta shook her head. "Jacob saw old Miss Colebrook in the village. His joints are warning Jacob saw old Mr. Colebrook in the village. His joints are warning him something fierce. There's a storm coming, he says, the likes of which we've not seen in years." "Willie Colebrook likes to be dramatic, Lottie. He's exaggerating." As if to contradict her, the wind began to blow, bending the trees and chasing leaves across the ground. Ominous gray clouds gathered, churning the sky, and the former shower became a cascade. She repeated the same reassurance to herself, hearing her father's voice as she did so. "The river rises every few years, Isabel. Don't worry." Even so, she shivered. A couple of hours later, Isabel received her old friend in her father's study, the desk between them to shield her heart and trembling hands. Theodore Grant stood before her, damp top hat in pale fingers, auburn head bowed. She was struck by the similarities between this and the recent awkward scene with his father. "I am sorry, Isabel." "Sorry it didn't work, or sorry you were caught?" He flinched. "Both. I really did think I could help you." "Fix me, I think you mean. Change me, like one of your patients with a chronic illness or addiction. I am the patient with a mental disorder you were certain you could cure in time." He looked up, green eyes wide. "Of course I wanted to help you. I care for you, Isabel. You know I do. As a friend, and possibly as more." She bit the inside of her cheek, clamping down her emotions. Then she said, "Possibly being the salient word. I used to wonder what you were waiting for. Arminda, Rose, even Lottie asked me why we didn't propose. Why a man with your ability and ambition was apparently content to stay here and practice in tiny Riverton, having to stitch wounds and lance goiters and everything else that needs doing, instead of moving to Edinburgh to join a large, prestigious practice. Arminda suggested that perhaps you thought you were not good enough, not yet established enough to marry. But as the years passed, that excuse grew rather spindly. Rose, ever the romantic, said you were not sure of my affections. If only I would show myself willing, make some grand romantic gesture, that you would be spurred to act. Only Carlotta doubted your affection for me." She slowly shook her head. "Another answer lingered in the back of my mind, but I didn't want to believe it. We were friends. We were fond of each other. Even loved one another, I thought. But the truth was there all along. It wasn't that you thought you were not good enough for me, but that I was not good enough, not whole enough for you. You were waiting not to further establish your practice, but to cure me. You would not marry me as I was, imperfect, trapped by my fears, and evidence of your failure to heal a patient." He spread his hands. "Is that so wrong? To want to cure you? To want to not be limited to this island for the rest of my life? Yes, I am ambitious. I want to practice elsewhere. But I want to take you with me, as my wife. So I waited, hoped, tried. But patience, understanding, and encouragement had no effect, so you took matters into your own hands, devised a new experiment like on one of your caged mice. Yes, I see. Well, your experiment failed. Isabel, I still think we—" She raised a palm. "No. There is no we without trust." She rose and faced him squarely. "I think it is time, Dr. Grant. Time for you to accept that partnership in Edinburgh. Time for you to take all of your frustrated ambition and modern methods somewhere far away where they might be better appreciated. I won't press for charges unless you return." For a moment he stood there, studying her face for any crack in her resolve, biting his lip as he waited. She did not move a muscle. Then his shoulders slumped, and he nodded. More than fair. He reached toward her, but then let his hand fall back to his side without touching her. Well, goodbye, Isabel. Goodbye, Dr. Grant, she coolly replied, but her disillusioned, battered heart silently cried, Goodbye, Teddy, my oldest friend, confidant, and companion. How lonely I shall be without you. She listened to his receding footfalls, then stepped to the window. From there she watched him walk away through the rain, over the bridge, and out of her life. Isabel retreated to her room to collect herself. Carlotta was there, again standing at the window. The water had risen to the top of the bank, the current moving fast, the color a malevolent, brackish gray. The wind continued to howl, blowing the rain sideways. Carlotta said, I've never seen it like this before. The current seems almost angry and carrying around so much flotsam. Concern increasing, Isabel decided to talk to Abel, who was always a voice of calm reason, when he spoke at all. Knowing an umbrella would be useless in such gusts, Isabel donned her brother's long storm coat instead and went outside. The water was beginning to creep up the lawn. Farther out, the usual fishing boats and eel skiffs were absent. No net makers sat on the opposite shore. Even the ducks and grebes had flown elsewhere, looking for shelter. In the paddock, she saw the London carriage horses jigging and tossing their heads, uneasy in the storm. She found her groundsman with the sheep, trying to soothe the restless, bawling ewes. They don't like this weather, and neither do I, Abel said. Time to take 'em inland. Sir John's steward won't mind, not with its raining hatchets and hammers. Isabel nodded. Can you bring the horses into the stables first? Get them to settle down? We may need them to pull the chaise later. I shall try. Maybe Evan can help me. He looked around to no avail, and then started to the paddock on his own, just as Mr. Grant appeared, collar turned up, water dripping from his hat brim. He sent her a pained look, then quickly averted his gaze. I can help with the horses. Isabel hesitated, then stifled her refusal. Silas Grant was famously good with horses, and Abel and the sheepdog would have their work cut out for them trying to herd the panicked sheep over the bridge. Very well. She knew the man was desperate to make amends, but even so the words, thank you, stuck in her throat. Mr. Grant calmed the carriage horses enough to put leads on them and led them into the relative safety of the stables. Safe for how long? As soon as Benjamin was free, he retrieved the file and read the old invoice for a custom-built traveling chariot more closely. The special features included a rooftop imperial, which was a storage space over the roof, like a large built-in valise, and inside the chariot, velvet upholstery and a concealed security compartment. Had Abel Curtis known of this compartment and looked there already? Probably. Such features were fairly common, he supposed, though he did not know from personal experience, as no one in his family had ever owned such a fine carriage. Studying the diagram once more, he decided to go outside for another look. Dashing through the rain with a lantern a few minutes later, he passed Mr. Grant on the path and was surprised to find Miss Wilder just leaving the stables, the carriage horses in stalls behind her. Something in his expression must have caught her attention, for she asked, "What is it?" "Probably nothing," he replied, not wanting to raise her hopes, or his. Even so, she followed him back inside. He explained, "The traveling chariot had a hidden compartment. I thought I'd try to find it, just in case." He glanced over at her. "Are you sure you want to see it again?" "No." She continued to follow him anyway. Benjamin led the way to the last stall, and hung the lantern on a hook. As he removed the tarpaulins, she held back, hovering outside the gate. "I didn't think it would affect me so, not after all this time," she swallowed. I was wrong. He pulled open the carriage door again and searched for the concealed compartment. Running his hand beneath the bench, his fingers found a small latch. He pulled and pushed and felt it release, but the drawer did not open. I'll need a crowbar or something. There are tools in the tack room. She led the way and opened the door. He selected a few metal tools and carried them back to the carriage. The first was too thick, but the second file slipped into the groove, and he was able to pry open the drawer. Anything? Yes. Not sure what, though. Using his fingernails, he peeled up a corner of the lining and extracted the drawer's contents. Folded paper. It could be anything, he reminded himself. He carried it to the lantern for better light. She followed him. What is it? Benjamin looked over the page, scanning the handwriting that had become familiar after reviewing so many pages of correspondence in Mr. Wilder's office. Holding his breath, he turned the page over. Was it signed? Dated? Exultation filled him. His last will and testament. He still bequeaths the estate to be managed through the trust with Mr. Norris as a trustee, but only until you reached your majority, at which point you and Rose, through grace, become heirs outright and the trust is terminated. Yes! She raised her hands in victory, then threw them around his neck in an exuberant embrace. He reacted without thinking, his arms encircling her waist, drawing her close. For a moment they stood like that, Benjamin's heart pounding, breathing in the sweet smell of her hair and relishing the narrowness of her waist. She glanced up at him, and he sank deep into her beautiful blue eyes, tempted to kiss her. He leaned closer, but then Miss Wilder seemed to recall her surroundings, or her companion, and stepped back with an awkward little laugh. Sorry. Don't be. Her tongue darted over her lips. Is it legal? Kissing you? He thought. It should be. Then he cleared his throat. I think so. It is signed by your father and witnessed by Silas Grant and a... He squinted to read the scrawled signature. Will Tompkins? He was a groom here. Just as Mr. Grant said. Benjamin read further, then stated, with this document we should be able to revoke the trust, or at least establish you as the sole trustee. Thank God. Yes, and thank your father. Well, I had better show this to Mr. Hardy, but we'll talk later, all right? Yes, of course. She smiled tremulously and left the stable before him. He covered the chariot and walked out after her, his heart still thumping, which had little to do with the excitement of the find. Returning to the house, he found Mr. Hardy in the study and showed him the newer will. The more seasoned attorney reviewed the hurriedly composed lines, the somewhat scrawled handwriting, and barely legible signatures. He knit his brow. I don't know, Ben. I am not certain this will stand up in court, especially when compared to the entire professionally drafted document. After all, Miss Wilder was only 20 when her father wrote this, and he was clearly rushed and harried and perhaps not thinking clearly. It is possible we can convince a judge, of course, but I would not want you to raise Miss Wilder's hopes prematurely. Ben wondered fleetingly if Mr. Hardy had changed his mind about wanting to serve as trustee. Either way, his mentor's caution deflated Ben's exhilaration. Yet he hesitated to tell Miss Wilder of Mr. Hardy's concerns. He had liked seeing her so happy, especially after the sad losses of the family pet and her oldest friend, not to mention worries about Redknapp and the flood. He had also liked the warm admiration shining in her eyes when she'd embraced him and thanked him for finding it. Would it really all be for nothing? He hoped not. How ironic, Isabel thought, to finally find the newer will, naming her mistress of the estate, just when she was in danger of losing it to a flood. The rain continued to fall, the water to rise, and Isabel to pace. She, Carlotta, and the housemaids had already carried as many family heirlooms as they could from the ground floor to the higher floors, just in case. But surely the water wouldn't reach the house. Looking for comfort and wisdom, Isabel pulled out her memorabilia box, opened her father's New Testament and Psalms, and skimmed through its well-worn pages. Why had she not done so before? 3 verses in the Psalms leaped out at her. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters roar and be troubled. The words seemed to carry equal parts comfort and warning. Troubled waters indeed. She turned next to the New Testament. Where was that verse Mr. Booker's mother so often quoted when anxiety struck? Flipping pages, she finally reached Paul's letter to the Philippians and drew in a breath of surprise. There it was in the 4th chapter, underlined in ink by her own father. There all the time. Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Thank you, Isabel whispered, and she prayed to her Heavenly Father for the first time in far too long. Later, she went down to the kitchen to gather the midday meal for the weavers. There she heard old Roy Houghton and Mrs. Philpotts debating the likely causes of the flood. Heavy snow in the winter, late melt, changes in the tide, rain, perhaps all of the above. Noticing her, Mrs. Philpotts said, I already sent Jacob down with the hamper, miss. You shouldn't be going out in this. That was kind of you both, though I would not have minded. In fact, Isabel could remain indoors no longer. Again slipping into her brother's storm coat, she went outside and walked around the island in the rain, surveying the encroaching water. When she reached the weaving shed, she saw Mr. Linton inside lifting tools and supplies to higher shelves. Around the room, the weavers were still trying to work, though their nervous glances at the ever-nearing water showed they were struggling to concentrate. Isabel couldn't blame them. Mr. Linton approached her and lowered his voice. Told you we should have built it on higher pilings. Yes, you did, but it's too late for reproaches about the past. What do we do now? Get all the completed baskets out of here and the boathouse before they're ruined. Can't Willow withstand water? Not foul flood waters. They'll be moldering and rank if they sit in that muck. Unsellable. Dread filled Isabel at the thought. We have orders for those baskets, and we will need the revenue to pay next year's cutters. He nodded. All the more reason to get them out of here. Abel has yet to return from herding the sheep inland, but Jacob and Roy could help, and the weavers if they are able. I'll help too, Mr. Booker said, striding around a large puddle to join them. He was wearing a familiar oilcloth coat. Seeing her studying it, he said apologetically, I assume it's your father's. I asked if there was an oilskin I could borrow, and this is what Adair's valet found. I hope you don't mind. Not at all. I'm glad to see you in it. Silas Grant rode up in the wagon. How strange to see their old coachman with reins in his hands once more. Disapproval swept over her, but she decided this was not the time to refuse anyone's help. Mr. Linton called, Let's form a line. As the weavers moved into place, Isabel saw the expectant Jenny and her mother, and said kindly, You go on home, Jenny, and you too, Mrs. Wingfield. Nothing doin'. We want to help. The weavers, along with Mr. Booker, Jacob, and Roy Houghton, formed a line between the shed and the wagon. Evan Curtis and Carlotta soon joined them, wading into the ankle-deep water. Isabel noticed Mr. Christie, the blind basket-maker, hesitating near the stacks of precious baskets in the shed. Mr. Christie, perhaps you had better make your way to higher ground? Isabel suggested. Joe would escort you, I'm sure. While all our work is washed away? No thank you, Miss Wilder. I will stay and help. I am not an invalid. Isabel felt her cheeks heat. Of course not. I didn't mean to imply you were, but... Right here, Mr. Christie, Evan called. We could use another man in line. Joe led him to a place between Roy and Evan, and Mr. Christie extended his capable hands to Roy, accepted the large woven hamper handed to him, swiveled, and placed it into Evan's hands as quickly and as efficiently as anyone there. After a few minutes, Isabel saw Rose and Mr. Adair making their way gingerly toward them, huddled together under a futile umbrella. They skirted the lake that had formerly been the path, her niece's eyes wide in concern. "Aunt Belle, do you need more help?" Mr. Adair looked from the muddy water to his polished boots with a pinched expression. "Looks dangerous, my love." Isabel took pity on the young dandy. "Perhaps you two had better go and pack. Might be wise to be ready to leave, just in case." "Surely you don't think the water will reach the house?" I didn't think it would reach this shed, and I was wrong. The ground is lower here, but I don't want to take any more risks." "Come, my dear." Mr. Adair took Rose's arm and turned her back. "We shall help O'Toole and the Manvers pack our things." "Rose," Isabel called after her, "warn everyone in the house to be ready to leave if the water continues to rise." "I will." "Mrs. Philpotts is packing up the silver and will alert the kitchen staff and housemaids, but Mr. Hardy may not realize what's going on." "I'll find him and make sure he knows." "Thank you." Isabel turned back to the task at hand. She surveyed the human chain, and her chest expanded with fondness and gratitude. The baskets her family of weavers had so carefully crafted were now being conveyed to safety by several people dear to her, including, she realized, Mr. Booker. Her gaze rested on him and her heart thumped. He had removed his outer coats and worked in waistcoat and shirt sleeves. Again and again he hefted a stack of baskets or a large hamper into the wagon. His hair fell over his forehead and his face glistened with sweat. He had never looked more handsome. I bet he did. It's like a wet t-shirt contest out there, I bet, with all that rain.